Today we'll be looking at bankruptcy filing trends by chapter in the state of Kentucky. To do this, we have about a dozen charts showing bankruptcy activity in the state going back to 1990. All of this data on filings comes from the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. Now, this first chart shows total filings by year since 1990. During that time, there have been 534,000 cases filed in the state. In the early 1990s, filings were running in the 12 to 15,000 per range. By the late 1990s, a little over 20,000 per year. This jumped up to nearly 30,000 in the early 2000s, just prior to bankruptcy reform. A big jump in 2005 because of bankruptcy reform. A big drop off down to about 12,000 cases in 2006. Filings got back up to 25,000 per year by 2009, but they never did reach where they had been in the years prior to bankruptcy reform, and then have dropped off the last 6 years and are down to about where they were back in the early 1990s. And that is actually a fairly typical pattern nationwide of what's happened over the years. Now, this chart shows, or map shows, filings relative to population over the period from 1990 to 2015. The red states have the highest bankruptcy rates. The yellow states have the lowest, more than 25% below average. And Kentucky is actually fairly high. They have averaged 20% above average of the national average from 1990 through 2015, and are the ninth highest among the states. Looking at it year by year, you can see that you can pretty much put things into about three categories. 1990s, right at or maybe a little bit above the national average most years. A bigger gap, from 2000 to 2006 relative to the national average, and about 20% above average since then. So, but for many years, the bankruptcy rate in Kentucky has been above the national rate relative to population. Now, this chart shows Chapter 7 filings by year from 1990 through 2015, around 10,000 per year in the early 1990s, around 17 or 18,000 late 1990s, over 20 in the years prior to bankruptcy reform. Big jump in 2005, followed by a huge drop in 2006, pretty much the lowest ever. Increased, more than doubled by 2009, but didn't get back to pre-reform levels, and then dropped by nearly half since then. And right now, filings are about what they were. Chapter 7 filings are about where they were back in the early 1990s in the state. Looking at Chapter 11 cases filed per year, there's a big drop off through the 1990s, which occurred in pretty much every state. Since then, filings have been running about 50 to 75 per year, with more during and after the national recessions. It looks like in 2015 there'll only be about 25 filed in the state, which is very low, because most states actually are Chapter 11 activity is increasing this year. Now, looking at Chapter 13 activity in the state, in the early 1990s it was below 3,000 per year, around 4,000 or 3,500 in the late 1990s, and then kind of steady increase up to nearly 6,000 by 2005. Drop off in 2006, and most states saw that after bankruptcy reform. Filings actually went back up and hit their all-time peak in 2010. It's one of the few states that has peaked up most recently in Chapter 13s, and then have dropped off, but not as much as most other states. And so on a historical level, filings are well above where they were throughout the 1990s in the state. Looking at the percent of cases filed as Chapter 13s, The national average, the red line here, has been right around 30% most years. Kentucky had been at 20% or below through the 1990s and early 2000s, and has jumped up and is still a little bit below the national average, but has climbed to over 30% over time. So the percentage of the case mix is slowly changing over time, Kentucky, towards Chapter 13 cases. Well, this next chart shows the unemployment rate by quarter in Kentucky, which is kind of a proxy for how the economy is going. And basically, Kentucky has followed the national patterns, but generally been a little bit above, maybe 1% or so above the national average in the unemployment rate. But both nationwide and in Kentucky, the rates have really dropped over the years, and so right now are down around 5%. Bankruptcy filings nationwide peaked most recently in September 2010 and have fallen each of the last 6 years. Nationwide, the decline has been 49%. In Kentucky, a little less than that at 40%. And on this map, yellow are the states that have had the lower declines, and mostly in the southeast. The biggest declines have been some good part of New England and most of the Southwest, where filings in some states are down by 70% from where they were back in 2010. But Kentucky is more on the low end of the declines at about 40%. Now looking at it quarter by quarter, you can see that for mostly from 2011 through 2015, the declines were generally between 10 and 15% every quarter, but the rate of decline is slowing down nationwide. And in Kentucky, it was more in the 10% range most quarters. And right now we have kind of an unclear pattern where it's hard to tell exactly whether filings are going to go up or down. In the first 6 months of the year, Kentucky had a very modest increase compared to about a 6% decline nationwide. You can see the red states here on this map are states that actually show an increase. And if we looked 2014 and 13, any of the past 5 years, there wouldn't be any red states. And now we're starting to see some states show increases. Filings were down by 3% in the third quarter in the state, so that puts Kentucky into a net decline for the year, just barely. But I think overall the outlook is for about 15,000 cases filed in 2016, slight increases in the coming years. I don't see any return to the 25 to 30,000 cases that were filed in the state per year in, say, 2001, 2004, unless another recession hits or some sort of bankruptcy reform legislation comes along. Well, that concludes our look at bankruptcy filings in Kentucky. For more statistical information and other information on bankruptcy, be sure to visit the newsroom section of the ABI website at www.abi.org.